In the previous video, we finished our main abstract controller class. In this video, we are going to start working our login controller. Up until now, we only returned hello from within login controller on this index method. If we preview the page in a browser, obviously there's nothing fancy here, just a bit of a string. But that's obviously not what we want from this login controller to return. So what we're going to start with is, first of all, we are going to create the property rules, protected rules, and this is when we're going to declare what sort of validation we want on our login form. And we're going to have for email field, what I would like to have is to make sure that it's not empty, so required, and then pipe and email. By pipe I mean this vertical line basically. So we want to make sure that it's not empty and that it's also of the correct email format. Then we're going to go for the password, which should be required. It cannot be empty. So these are the rules that I want to apply to the validation of our login form. Okay, then after the rules, what I'm going to do is use this protected function constructor. I'm going to overwrite it because if we go back to the controller, by default, it's just an empty method and it's being called from within the constructor. So rather than us creating a new constructor, calling the parent constructor, we have this method available just to make sure that when we load the login controller, when it's instantiated, that this method is added to the main constructor basically. So whatever we post here is going to run together with the constructor. So from within this one, what I want to do is to make sure that if the user is already logged in, that it doesn't access this controller at all. So this RedirectIfLoggedIn method. You may remember we've created this method in a previous video. If we scroll down here, RedirectIfLoggedIn, and it checks if user is not authenticated, then return null. In other words, user will remain on this page. Otherwise, we are going to redirect them to the dashboard page after the login, because we know it's logged in. It shouldn't see the login screen if it's logged in. Okay, so we make sure that obviously login page is only for those who are not logged in. And let's just quickly add the dog block. So let's actually copy this dog block from this method. Let's just copy this here. And there we go. That's a response. We should probably import this response as well. That's the Symfony component HTTP Foundation response. So I'm just going to paste it, not here, right above this login controller response, and obviously use statement. And there we go. So that's the one we're after. And that's the one that's being returned from this constructor. Okay, so that's our constructor. And now the next thing that I want to do is to make sure that obviously we can see our form. So from within the index method, which is what's being called when we're actually accessing the our login page, which is without any arguments in the URL, then we simply return this view, and the view is on the pages and login. And that's all we need to return. Let's just quickly add dog blocks as well here. And again, that returns view. So let's import it, factory as well. Let's keep it like this. And then we are going to say display login form. Let's just actually remove this factory. Let's just keep it as a view because that's what we expect to receive here. Let's just remove this factory. So illuminates view, and then obviously this response for the from the Symfony package. Okay, so if we now save it and preview it in the browser, refresh the page, and there we go. Our login form suddenly shows up. If we hit on login, it's automatically validating using JavaScript. So let's go back to the editor and let's actually have a look at this login page. So we go to this resources, views, pages, and then this login.play.php. I'm going to close the browser here on the left. So let's have a look at what we've got here. We've got this form which submits the request using the post method. Then we have the action is going to be login post, so it's going to call login control again, and method is going to be called post. Then we have some data attributes, which are basically being used with this SSD form jQuery plugin that's used with this exercise. Obviously, if you're using different sort of validation and submission, then you can obviously remove these two arguments here, and obviously these properties and create your own ones, whatever you are using for submitting the form. Okay, then we have for the validation, we have a block here. If we return required, then this message is going to be shown. If errors will contain email, this message is going to be shown. If invalid, this message is going to be shown. If inactive, then we're going to show the message that your account has not been activated, and then we show the link to resend the activation email. This is only in case if we just open our file browser, open env, if this verification is set to true, because in that case we will have to send the verification email. User have to click this email in order to activate the account. But if they didn't verify, if I just close this and close this response as well, if they didn't verify the account, then the account is still going to be there. It's just they won't be able to log in, at which point we're going to show them this message, obviously, that the account isn't active. It's there, but it's not active, so you cannot access it. Please make sure that you activate it. Just click on this link that will resend the activation email, and you will be able to activate it. Okay, and then we have some technical problems. For any reason something happened, then we catch it and obviously display this technical error. Then we have obviously our inputs, which has type, is going to be email, name, and ID email as well. And then data validate is where our validation rules are placed. Again, required and email. For this one, for password, we have validation only required. If it's going to be empty, that message is going to be shown. And it's type of the password, name, and ID password. And obviously for data validate, the rule is to be required basically, so the input isn't empty. Then we have the checkbox remember me. This one doesn't have any validation. It may be checked or unchecked. It doesn't really matter. Then obviously based on whether we receive it with the request, we will set this remember me token or using cookies. And then we have this input submit button, which is the trigger that you see when you actually preview the login form. But once the submission started, we're going to hide this button, and this second button, pending one, data submit pending, is going to be shown, which has this spinner which is rotating and basically the label saying processing. And then the data confirmation is if we need to, I don't think this specific form uses it because this is when we're showing basically the confirmation message. The form fades out, and then whatever message has been returned with the AJAX call is going to be put into this paragraph and displayed on the page instead of the form. But as if we scroll up, you'll see that for the behavior we have redirect, so we could probably remove this this paragraph, but let's just leave it there for the time being, because after we've managed to log in, we will be automatically redirected to our dashboard page. Okay, so that's our form. So now we know what we've got within this form. Let's just close it. We have our index page, basically our form displayed on a page as well, which is great. Let's just go back. So what happens when we submit the form? We need to create this post method, because this is where we're going to process actually the requested data and basically verify that the user exists and log them in, redirect to the dashboard. Okay, so we're going to start with a public function post. Not post request only, just post. And here we're going to start with this post request only, because we only allow, for this method, we only allow post request if we've basically if we just go back, actually, now that we have this method, this call to this method, if we go back, and if I just go and use get request, basically trying to access login post path, hit return, and there you go. We've got invalid request method, as you can see, because when we load in the page through the browser without actually submitting it using the post request, which you could do with obviously the form, then that's just a simple get request. But we need the post request. We are actually restricting access to this path to the post only. And now we're going to use the try and catch statement. Catch, and we're going to catch just the standard exception. And let's just import this exception as well here. So import, not generate, import. There we go. If you scroll up, you see this exception is here at the top. Okay, so we're going to start with this collect request, and we pass what items we want to collect from this request. So we want email, we want password, and we also want remember me item. So basically, when we hit the submit button, once the fields are filled in, we send this request with all this data that we have within the form to this post method. In other words, we check if the request was post, and it will be, because if we open this login, as you may remember, method is post, set to post here. Then we go to this try section. we collect the items that we want from this request, which is email, password, and remember me. If we go back to the form, we have this field email, with the name password, and the checkbox remember me. So these are the only items that we want to collect. If someone maliciously wanted to submit some other items, they will be ignored. And then what we're going to do is validate this request. So this validate request. And when we call this validate request, if we go back to this method, we first instantiating the validator. We pass the rules which we want, which are the rules that actually are associated with this property rules. We overwritten the default property rules on the controller, and we added these items here. And then input is what we've collected, calling this collect request method. So there we go. This is our input. We put the request items, which we pass through as an argument, only these items into the collection, creating a collection on this input property. So we're now validating it. And if it didn't validate, then obviously, if we go back, just check this validate request, what's going to happen if it didn't validate, that we're going to add these errors from within the validator to the errors property, and we're going to measure if there are any other errors obviously within this errors property, then they're going to be merged with the ones from within the validator. So if we pass this validate request call, then that means that obviously our data is all validated and it's all good, at which point we can log in the user. So this guard, which we pulled already from within the container in the main controller. So if we go back, check our constructor here, we have this guard here, which we pulled from within the container. So on this guard, we are going to call login method, and we pass this verify user method, which we create in just a moment, and then this input get remember me token. If it's going to be empty, then it's going to be basically a null. Otherwise, it's going to return that obviously this item is within the request. And if we click on this login, just to remind ourselves what it's got the second argument, remember me, whether it's set to true or false. If it's going to be within the request, in other words, if we check this checkbox, it's going to be basically representing Boolean true, at which point we're going to set this remember token. Otherwise, it's just going to be ignored and we won't send this, it won't set this cookie. Okay, so verify user method. Let's quickly create this one. It shouldn't be verify, it should be verify. Always helps if you spell it right. Okay, so verify user. What we're going to do here is basically create a new user instance. So user equals user, but we're going to try it and find it by email. You remember this scope by email method, which searches for the user record by its email. So this input, we pull item email from it, and then we try to get the first item that matches the record with this email. Then there will be only one item anyway. Okay, let's import this user model, which is app models user. If we scroll up just to make sure that we obviously have it, I'm just going to put our custom component separate from any packages. So it's going to be here on new line. So now we check in user by email. We get this email item from within the input. We call it as an array, even though it's a collection. We could also do something like this, get, and then use the index, basically name of the field that we want to get from within this collection. We can do it this way or the other, it doesn't really matter. And then what we're going to check is if is not is null user. That means that we found the user, which is great. That's what we wanted to do. And then we return this and another method, check user password. So this at this point we are going to validate this user whether the password actually matches the password that has been submitted with the form. So first we get in the user by email. Once we've got the instance of the user by email, then we're going to validate its password, the password that we've submitted with the same request. But before I do, I go ahead and create this check user password method. Let's simply return this invalid credentials method, which is going to basically return response back to the user if the credentials were invalid. Okay, so what we're going to, well, it's not going to actually return the response yet. It's going to throw an exception and add error to the errors array, this property errors on the controller. Let's start with this check user password method. So let's add it. And here, this user is going to be user instance. So let's type hinted as well. User, there we go. So we know exactly what we're dealing with, and our ID knows what methods are available on this instance. And we're going to start if is not user, and we call method verify password. And now we are passing the input, this input, and then we can again use get method on it. And we want to get item password from our request. So if it doesn't verify, then obviously that means that the credentials were invalid. So we cannot allow this user basically to log in. And we're going to again delegate this to another method, actually not another method, the same method as we've got here, this invalid credentials. So this invalid credentials at this point. So obviously we know at this point the password was incorrect. Return the same thing as if you would return when we couldn't find the user by email. Now, otherwise, we are going to return the call to another method called check if active, and we pass user as argument. So once again, let's try and see what we're doing here. We are trying to pass this verify user to the login method, which takes instance of the user class and then remember me token. So this verify user should return user instance potentially, but it may fail obviously while it's trying to do so. So let's quickly return user. We're going to keep it like this, and then it will throw exception. And let's just say verify user. That's what this method does. Okay, so what we're doing here now, this verify user first of all tries to obtain the instance of the user by email, by this using this line here, obviously this scope by email method. And if this user is not null, then obviously we know the user has been found in a database by this email address. So we have instance of the user here. Otherwise, we return invalid credentials because obviously user could not be found. So we definitely don't have user by this email within our database. But if we do, then we check user password next to make sure that the password that the user submitted with this email is also valid. So we check in here if user verified password is not correct with this exclamation mark, then we obviously know that the credentials submitted were incorrect. The email was correct because we got the user record, but the password was not correct. So again, we're going to return the call to this invalid credentials method. And then if we pass this conditional here, that means that the user has been found and that the password was valid. At which point we're going to do one last check to check whether the account is active, whether the flag that the active table cell basically has value 1, which would indicate that user is active. But obviously within this active method, we need to check whether, first of all, our system is set to accept verification. If it's going to be set to false, then it's going to ignore this active field altogether. But that's all that's going to happen within this check if active method. Before we get to this check if active, let's just create this invalid credentials method so that at least we have this one sorted. Okay, invalid credentials is simply going to run this @error, and we want the error for the email field. And the message that we want to show within our form is going to be this invalid credentials. We don't want to say whether it's email or password. You don't want to let them know exactly which ones are wrong. Just tell them that the credentials they've submitted are invalid. So we're going to use invalid as the value. And then we need to throw the exception to terminate the execution of the chain basically here. So throw new exception, and we pass the message just saying user not found. At this point, when we obviously return one of these invalid credentials, either here or here, this method will obviously terminate. We won't log in the user because this will fail obviously with this exception, and we're going to be redirected to this exception block here. So let's maybe, before we go any further, let's just deal with this exception here. So we catch this exception. What would we want to do if there's obviously invalid request? If the data didn't validate, let's return instance of the new JSON response. And we're talking about the Illuminate HTTP JSON response, and we pass here errors as our argument. So this errors, which is going to be the array which we want to convert to the JSON format. And the second argument is going to be a status code, which is going to be returned with this response. And in our case, I'm going to use 422, but rather than hard typing this here, I'm going to use the response that we already have here, this component HTTP Foundation response, and use one of the constants, which is called HTTP unprocessable entity. I'm just going to put the actually semicolon for the time being because we're not finished yet. I'm going to click on this constant to take us to this class. As you can see, there's a long list of status codes as represented by the constants. You can use whichever one you want. I think that using the verbose approach like this is a little bit better because it tells us exactly what the problem is. Okay, so I put the semicolon here, but before we put the semicolon, we have to run the method called send headers and then get content to return the JSON, the returned response in the JSON format back to the client. Okay, so this is our exception. At this point, our errors will be converted into a JSON response, and then obviously our form will react to it accordingly, obviously through this JavaScript plugin, this jQuery plugin. Okay, let's close this .env file and let's finish this methods. So after the login, we want to return JSON response as well, but with slightly different data. So return. And again, I'm inlining this. You could obviously do something like this, for instance, response equals new JSON response, and then obviously pass all these arguments and then chain it and so on. But I'm going to inline it the same way I did here. So I'm just in between the brackets, I put statement new JSON response, and here I'm going to put the values. I'm going to actually type in the array. It's going to be redirect. This is when I want to redirect the user, and again, this is going to be passed through back to the client in a JSON format, so they will get this redirect item with where we want the redirect to redirect the user after the login, and we want to redirect them to the dashboard. And then again, the same thing, send headers and get content. And that's all that we need to return. So when we manage to verify the user and we log them in, we redirect them to the dashboard. Otherwise, we are going to return all the errors in the JSON format back to the client so they can deal with it, basically showing their validation messages accordingly. Okay, so let's scroll down. We have this verify user completed as well. Let's add doc blocks to the check user password. It takes user, throws exception if there's something wrong, and let's say check password. Then if we scroll down, we have this invalid credentials as well. For the invalid credentials, we have it throws exception, and then invalid credentials exception. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, after this, we need to create this check if active method. So let's just add it. And user, let's type hinted as user. So we have all of the methods available from within the IDE automatically. And before we add the doc blocks, let's just do the implementation of this method. So we check if .env is, and then we check the variable verification set to true. This is method on the .env package will tell us whether this variable has value set to true. And then we check end exclamation mark user is active, which would say if user is not active, then we know that user should be active, but it's not, at which point we simply say return this. And then we go into create another method in just a second called inactive, which is going to be basically something like this: invalid credentials. It will add the error to the errors array, and then to this property, and then throw the exception so we can actually return the errors back to the user so they can show the message within the form. Otherwise, we know everything is fine, and we can proceed with the redirection to the dashboard, and obviously logging in the user, so we return this user instance. And let's add the doc block here now. We're going to say check if user is active, and this will throw an exception as well. It returns user, but it will throws exception. It doesn't know it yet because we don't have this inactive method, but from within this inactive method we will throw the exception. So obviously this method will also throw this exception once this inactive triggers it. Okay, from within the inactive, we're going to run this, add error, we're looking for the email field, and then inactive item. So if we go back to the login, we have this inactive. So this is going to be shown to the user. Your account has not been activated. We've got this account, but it's inactive. Click on this link to resend the activation email. You will receive it. Obviously, click on that and so on. Let's go back to this login, and the last thing is throw new exception to make sure that obviously we won't log in the user eventually. User not active. And I think that's enough. Let's add some doc blocks here. Throws exception and inactive exception. I think that's enough. Okay, and let's remove these redundant lines here. And I think our login controller is nearly completed. Let's just, this one's squeaking for something. Let's add return tag here. Return user or void. Does it return void? Invalid credentials, it's exception, so we'll only return user or throw the exception. So there's no void really here. Okay, and I think that's this. Let's just check all of the methods. We haven't got doc blocks for the post method here, so let's quickly add it. Return string. It's not really, I mean, it's a JSON response. Let's just put JSON response rather than string because it's a bit confusing. And then process request. And then we have index and all these properties and the constructor method. And I think that's everything. So let's now go back to the browser. And if we remove what we've got here in the URL, login post, if we remove this and load just the login form, if we hit on this login button, obviously the validation shows up. And I'm going to open DevTools here in Chrome to see what we're going to be getting. When we submit the form, I'm just going to put info SSD tutorials. We obviously don't have any records in the database yet. Let's just open the database. If I refresh, you'll see there are no records, so we won't be able to log in anyway until we have this registration form done. And let's just put some passwords, secret, for instance, hit return, and there we go. We got, let's have a look at what the response got us here. We've got this post. It got this status 422, unprocessable entity, as you can see. And let's see the preview. We have this JSON format with email indicating that invalid flag should be shown within a form, and that's the one that's been shown here, as you can see, invalid credentials. If we try and hit it again, another request with the same response basically. So you cannot find email basically record with this email. This is the first one that if we go back to the editor and scroll down to this post, then verify user methods. So this is basically where it fails because it could not find user. It returned null when we tried to find user by email. So check user password. Sorry, it's not check user password. It's invalid credentials because here we're checking that the user actually exists if it's not null. So if we go to this invalid credentials, add error for the email field, the item is going to be invalid, and this is what's being shown here, invalid credentials. Basically, that's how all this works. Okay, so our login control, our login form is now completed. We will have a chance to test it a little bit better later on when we actually have some records within a user's table. But for now, that's it. Let's move to the next video when we start with the registration form.